Thanks for coming out this afternoon. We're here with Dr. Maria Izabel Mallmann, who's speaking on Brazil's foreign policy new dimensions. Just a little bit of background about Dr. Mallmann. She's an associate professor of political science at the Pontifcia Universidade Católica do Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. She has a PhD in political science from Universite Paris-Sorbonne, and she does research on Brazilian foreign policy, Brazilian identity, and Brazil's South American relations. Among others, her publications include The Conquest of the Lost Decade, Latin America, Democracy and Regional Diplomacy, Peace and War in the Era of Disorder, and Mercosur and the Regional Context. So we're happy to have her here, and looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I will read my paper because I think it's much better for you to understand me without improvisations. Okay, good afternoon. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Villanova University and particularly Latin American Studies, Political Science Department, and Office of International Studies for giving me this opportunity to visit campus and share my work with you. I would like to thank especially Satya Patnaik, Director of Latin American Studies, and Catherine Wilson of Political Science Department. Believe it or not, this is the first time that I have visited United States. And as many of you know, the first time you are in a foreign country is not always easy. So I would like to thank Celeste Mann and Kirsten Ernest from Department of Romance Languages, Karen Hollis of Department of English, Deborah Hoover of International Student Office, Joyce Harding, the wonderful assistant from Latin American Studies, and sisters of Rosamond College, all of whom made my stay in United States a friendly experience. Deborah Hoover and the English tutors, thank you, helped me with this presentation. As you may know, Deborah is an excellent teacher, but I will also prove she's not a miracle worker. So I start with my subject. I work about Brazilian foreign policy, and I intend present to you an overview of Brazilian foreign policy, BFP, from a Brazilian perspective, or Brazilian political perspective, based on literature review and document analysis. I have main ideas. In all, this paper contributes to understanding of BFP as a policy that presents much more continuities than ruptures during Brazilian Republican history, include BFP Lula's era. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was the president of Brazil during last decade. We also argue that goals linked to development and autonomy priorities command Brazilian external agenda, in spite of political regime changes. It means that we agree with experts like Servo that conceive the BFP more like a state policy than a government one. We are convinced that recent BFP confirms this thesis. During the polemic Lula period, for instance, we will observe that BFP presented continuity on some aspects, inflections on others, but it did not rupture, despite the president's activism. We are persuaded that structural factors and domestic perceptions about Brazilian interests and about its global place are in the origin of the BFP. Like in social phenomena, both dimensions, structural factors and domestic perceptions change, so that in Brazil case, one of the main political challenges nowadays is to articulate perceptions according to structural changes. Oh, I forgot to change the slide. Excuse me. This presentation is organized in 4 parts. The first one, aspects of Brazilian internal and regional reality. Second one, theoretical approach to understand BFP. Third one, BFP, main aspects and lines of continuity and inflections. And fourth, Brazilian responses to new current challenges and domestic structural limits. So at the first, the internal and regional reality. I present a chart with primarily the internal reality with positive aspects and negative aspects in 3 fields: political, social, and economic. In political terms, the most important positive aspect is the consolidation of democracy. After 20 years of a military regime, nowadays we observe some moderation from both left and conservative forces. Despite some perceptions contrary to this position, Brazilian politics have been much more pragmatic than ideological during the last decade. We also have negative aspects on the political field, like corruption, high level of corruption, and weak national awareness of the international projection costs. There's this last aspect is very important to foreign policy, because sometimes important sectors of Brazilian society don't support the governmental decisions. In the social field, we live an important social and economic inclusion process with income improvement. In spite it, Brazil occupies the 84th global position on HDI rank. We have deficit in education, health, transport, security, habitation, and so on. It means that the social tasks are one of our biggest challenges, which demands overcoming at least 2 more decades of public inclusion policies. In the economic level, we have good news. Our foreign debt was solved. We have a satisfactory economic growth and employment, and an internal market in expansion. We also have an important international projection. Finally, we are in sixth position on global GDP rank. The bad news are an infrastructural deficit, ports, airports, roads, taxes, and bureaucratic problems, and the less human resource training. These aspects increase the obstacles to a sustainable growth. In short, at the internal level, Brazil needs to work to solve structural problems and change some perceptions about its new responsibilities in the world. Along with these enormous domestic problems, Brazil has to face neighbors' claims that are stimulated by its regional privileged position. Brazil has about 50% of South America's GDP and population. It occupies 50% of South America area. 50% South American natural resources are under Brazil's sovereignty. And it has bordered with 10 out of 12 South American countries. So it's a geopolitical position very important on the region. This geopolitical condition is an important factor that explains some aspects of BFP, like its preference for passive solution of controversies. Brazil is interested in South America political, social, and economic stability, obviously. South America manufacturing and technological market too. And Brazil is interested too in avoid foreign powers presence in South America. We have today a strong presence of the United States in Colombia, military presence in Colombia, Paraguay. We have presence of Russia in Venezuela, and France, Guyana Francesa. So we have China on the market in general, in all countries of South America, China is present. So Brazil works in order to occupy these spaces and avoid the augmentation of foreign countries' presence in South America. An important task for Brazil is to change its international insertion without intimidating its neighbors, to change seeming to be the same or better. It's another aspect, the difference of power between Brazil and the other South America countries many times provoked suspicion against Brazil from the other countries, governments, South America. Theoretical approach. I put some ideas on this slide, but this part is more complete here. So I read here. Close to Watson approach, we consider present BFP as structural factors were framed during a long historical and sociological capitalism expansion process in which the country was involved. Also, on the same Watson perspective, we consider the states make decisions based on their own interests. In some circumstances, these actors' interests can be identified more or less with the hegemon power. Pressures caused by the former political actors' choice determine its change. So, according to this perspective, we could imagine the international society evolution playing a nonlinear movement that could be represented by a pendulum idea that oscillated between extremes, either total independence or total subordination, and pushed to moderate position by a niched consequence of its former choice. This pendulum idea will be taken in consideration in the next part of this presentation, when we will discuss BFP main aspects and explain its change. Concerning the national interests concept, we work with Wells and Kratochwil. According to Wells, the domestic and international interaction plays an important role on the national interest formation and on its permanent retracing. Like many other political phenomena, national interest definition is a political contentious object because it involves redistribution resources. In spite of the possibilities of negotiations, in extreme situations, an authoritative decision can be inevitable. When foreign agenda subjects provoke internal political divisions, the government authorities should establish what is in the nation's interests, disclosing a preference, but not a personal or private preference, a preference with strong social support. So, when we refer here to pragmatic decisions, national interests, BFP, we do not ignore that it involves preferences. In a pluralistic regime, many more social sectors take part in the national interests definition. And a pluralistic society is permanently including new actors and claims, retracing continuously the imaginary nation borders. In the Brazil case, the historical slower social inclusion probably weakened the discussion around national interest definitions and made the BFP less controversial for a long time. This changed in the last decade when new political forces arrived at the government and produced important impacts on foreign policy, legitimated by a new conception of national interest, always based on autonomy and development ideas. Third part. In general terms, Brazil BFP experts identify some permanent ideas on the BFP, like cooperation, multilateralism, and pacific resolution of conflicts. These ideas are linked to two others ones, less visible, but still stronger: development and autonomy. Servo identifies four paradigms linked to development idea that commanded the BFP decisions: liberal conservative, developmental, neoliberal, and logistic. The periods and the main interests that commanded the decisions in each period. In spite of different emphasis of each paradigm, it's possible to affirm that the development is a permanent priority of different governments. In this sense, it's possible to observe continuities lines of BFP during last decades. Servo states that during Brazil's recent history, political changes are not directly related to BFP. Each time a foreign policy option was seen as putting development in danger, a policy change occurred, despite regime or government. During Cardoso government in the 90s, for instance, when the economic strategy provoked more damage than progress. The government decreased its idealistic adherence to a globalization, a liberal globalization. The same, according to Servo, the same happened during military regime. The alignment to United States was weakened when it did not turn out well for Brazil's economic interests. In Servo's point of view, this phenomenon discloses a state foreign policy rather than governmental one. We add that it shows periodic changes of BFP from an extreme position to another moderate one. Apart from Servo, Pinheiro's analysis pays attention to BFP specific political aspects. She works with another strong idea, autonomy. According to Pinheiro, the last century can be divided in phases in accordance with Brazil's orientation in relation to the main global power, like figure 2. She states that BFP oscillated between Americanism and globalism. She adds that Americanism was varied between an ideological and a pragmatic emphasis. The first one, ideological Americanism, occurred when the decision-maker perceptions were that Brazil's interests would be benefited if the country adopted American values. The second one, pragmatic Americanism, originates from a decision-maker's realistic perception about international relations, where each state should permanently negotiate its advantages in order to achieve its interests. The globalism took place when the dominant perception among decision makers was that Brazil should look for partnership among its peers. According to Pinheiro, this BFP orientation can be also divided into emphases, the globalism. One of them attached to a Russian perspective, which principal idea is that the adherence to international law is the way to achieve an egalitarian and pacific global order. The other emphasis was linked to a Hobbesian or realistic approach and conceives the international relations commanded by interests on an anarchic order where each state should act in order to achieve and preserve its own interests. We observe that the two BFP strong ideas, development and autonomy, present the same behavior. Both oscillate between ideological and pragmatic positions. And despite Servo and Pinheiro's references to phases, we can observe that the historical change plays a non-linear movement. If you compare both analyses, and remember the Watson pendulum idea, we could conceive BFP behavior during last century on a kind of pendulum which projected extremes are at one the pendulum project extremes are at the one time in total alignment and at the other in total autonomy, as can be seen in figure 3. Okay. Both extremes are based on ideological convictions and values. The material interests founded on a pragmatic perception about the best way to achieve the country's development and autonomy pull the pendulum to a moderate position. In other words, the horizontal line represents the ideological dimension of perceptions, where the values are prevailing in political decisions. The vertical line represents the pragmatic dimension of perceptions, where the material interests are more important than values in political decisions. Both ideological and pragmatic dimensions are present in all political decision making. They are differently combined according to historical circumstances, and these are responsible for different phases identified by authors, as it is shown in this slide. EA representing ideological Americanism, GG Grottian globalism, HG Hobbesian globalism, and PA pragmatic Americanism. The two first are more ideological and extreme or radical, and the others that are more the others two are more pragmatic and commanded by material interests. Finally, the last part, Brazilian responses to new current challenges in domestic structural limits. I selected three main global current challenges related to domestic limits in order to analyze some governmental responses. My objective here is to analyze the governmental responses, paying attention to the articulation between the two political levels, international and domestic. I will comment the first and the third cases only. In the first one, the government adopted two strategic ways in order to face the global capitalism pressures without sacrificing Brazilian economy and society. The two ways are reciprocal multilateralism and pragmatic universalism. In the reciprocal multilateralism, the government asks for reciprocity between structured economies and emergent countries. not only the trade field, but also in other areas, such economy in general, security, environment, health, and human rights. The pragmatic universalism way reinforces the country's historical relationships and founds many others in order to increase partnerships and business. Servo analyzes Lula's government performance in 5 international areas: economy, trade, security, environment, health, human rights. In all of them, Brazil worked with the purpose of obtaining results compatible with its concessions in promoting an actual interdependency. In order to achieve these goals, in the international trade, for instance, in 2003, the government shaped with other emerging countries the G20, which main focus was central countries' agricultural market liberalization as a counterpart of an emerging countries' manufacturing trade concessions. After the WTO negotiations sank, Brazil reinforced another alternative to expand markets more effectively. This is called pragmatic universalism here, and it involved efforts in order to maintain and deepen relations with traditional partners, South America, United States, Europe, and to improve it with others, such as China, India, and Japan. It also involved actions aiming at expanding Brazilian relations in the world. In spite of this orientation, Brazil did not abandon multilateral negotiations. In reaction to 2008 crisis, the country worked in order to reform the international financial system and reinforced IMF resources. In the third case, we observed that for many times the foreign government strategy was criticized by internal sectors for reasons based on the struggle for benefits distribution. Based on a critical appreciation of Brazilian ambitious international agenda, many fact-finders defended internal tasks priority. According to them, the country was spending precious resources abroad that should be better used on the domestic field. In fact, this is a dilemma that cannot be solved perfectly, as external and domestic fields are related. If less attention is paid to international affairs, this can result less conditions to solve internal problems. On the other hand, if internal problems persist, the difficulties to face foreign affairs can be greater. It seems that the government option was to work in both directions, domestic and international, with the same intensity, internally combating the poorness and at an international level opening new spaces to act. The country paid a high price for this strategy, especially in South America, where it faced disputes with Bolivia and Paraguay involving natural resources. In both situations, Brazil had important material losses that were transformed into political costs. Many Brazilian sectors showed some concern with the possibility of energy resource reduction in a near future and with the imminent augmentation of energy prices in Brazil as a consequence of the new agreement signed by Brazil with Bolivia and Paraguay. The Brazilian government was accused to give priority to partisan convictions. The term solidarity used by government to explain its preference for a kind of relationship based on mutual interests was identified as an ideological preference in spite of national interests. In spite of specific cases, there is a weak national awareness of the international projection costs. Brazilian society just perceives some of its benefits. In order to transform this cultural trace, the government took part in a public discussion about design new borders according to Brazil's interests, as well as through a discussion about the resolution between the relation between solidarity and national interest. The governmental authorities explained their national interest comprehension, evoking middle and long-term reasons linked to regional prosperity and disconnected from particular interests of some sectors. The Minister Celso Amorim also explained that solidarity and national interests are not in opposition. Solidarity can now serve national interests in middle and long term. Evoking the American President Theodore Roosevelt that said United States does not have friends but interests, the Brazilian minister commented that in Brazil governmental understanding, both terms are not in opposite position, but can be mutually complemented. In fact, during the period analyzed, some different ideas were introduced in the BFP discourse that showed the way that Brazil intends to conduct its international insertion. Final remarks. We consider the following aspects. The pendulum idea offers an adequate representation of BFP oscillations, important social, political, and economic change the BFP in a progressive but non-linear movement. New ideas and behaviors are included without ruptures in a historical manner of making foreign policy. The goals linked to development and autonomy priorities command Brazilian external agenda in spite of regime and or government. The development idea is attached to a 1930 thought and involves an effective state participation on economy. In this sense, the Lula's government of last decade represents the pendulum moving from a liberal position of 1990s decade to a position more realistic and pragmatic that involves state participation as a logistic service paradigm. The current government of Dilma Rousseff follows this orientation to even greater extent. So, if we consider the high possibility that she will have a second term in office, we can predict that the pragmatic pendulum trend will continue. Concern foreign relations, we expect in general continuity of the main BFP traces. We also expect the abandonment of Lula's radical actions, despite that Dilma Rousseff is in the same party. She faces the same challenges that Lula faced. At the internal level, she needs to work to solve structural problems and change some perceptions about the new responsibilities of the country in the world. At the international level, she needs to prospect new spaces and protect Brazil's interests without abandoning its historical identity traces. Thank you. We have some references.
We can take some questions for Professor Mallmann, if anyone has any, with respect to Brazilian foreign policy, where the current government's going, so forth. Oh, yes. We might need some translation.
Do you feel that Brazil will interact with the world on the world stage the same way it interacts with its South American partners, or do you see it being maybe a bit more cautious or a bit more aggressive on the world stage?
Você acha que o Brasil vai interagir na esfera internacional da mesma maneira que interage com a América do Sul, ou vai ser mais agressivo ou menos ou mais cauteloso assim na esfera mais global do que na América do Sul em geral?
In fact, I think that since Dilma government, since 2010, the aggressivity of Brazil on the international scene was weakened, diminued. So I think Brazil will act in order to prospect new spaces with a cautelous manner. Yes. President Dilma is not active, so active same President Lula was. So I think perhaps due her history, she prefers foreign policy more moderate than another that caused suspicions. It's about a consequence of the Olimpíadas and the Copa do Mundo in Brazil and on the other South America countries, and on the favelas. I think nowadays the government do Brazil and do Rio de Janeiro work together in order to resolve some certain problems with in the favelas, security, habitaciones. So I think in general the consequence will be positive, and for the economy, growth economy too, because there are many activities, constructions, and employment. Perhaps the problem will be the growth of inflation. Because the situation provoke high consumption with the same capability of production.
I get the feeling that Brazil has a really strong national identity, like the population, like many other countries in the area. But do you think that that's going to be detrimental or beneficial to their becoming a leading foreign policy country?
Ela acha que o Brasil tem uma forte identidade nacional. Você acha que essa identidade vai ajudar ou prejudicar o Brasil assim que estiverem nas relações internacionais?
Identidade.
Essa questão de identidade, essa forte identidade que tem, se vai, assim como o Brasil está subindo no mundo, se essa identidade vai entrar em conflito com as esferas internacionais.
I don't know if I have English sufficient to ask you, but ask you. Answer. Yes, but I think that this identity of a specific country with a rich culture can be positive to projection, international projection of Brazil, but the international projection include material interests, internationalization of big corporations, and banks. We have, for the first time, certain banks, Brazilian banks that compraram outros em outros lugares.
So for the first time, some Brazilian banks have bought out others.
Yes, and so we have each country that live same situation have a reaction contrary against. So I think perhaps some traces of our identity can be modified.
Does Brazil, and I can say it in Portuguese, does Brazil see itself as a leader in Latin America or something else? Because I know that they decided to have Portuguese being taught in a lot of other Spanish-speaking countries, and now Brazilians are learning Spanish. So what is the relationship how does Brazil see itself related to its neighbors?
Yes, historically, Brazil don't, didn't have a serious intention to an approximation with its neighbors. The first time when it occurred was since 90s. I think due to the economy, the non-similarity of the economies. There are many suspicions against Brazil on the other countries. And the part of Brazilian society, we have much, we ignore the reality of our neighbors. So perhaps it's necessary to change the mentality. And this change, this change can need the Brazilian policies in order to help the neighbors that claims for certain programs. For instance, Bolivia and Paraguay. But in general, Brazil is not a leader regional. It have the material conditions, but it didn't have the values.
Any other questions? Thank you, everyone, for coming.